I was flipping steaks on the grill, humming along to an old blues track, when a voice screeched over the fence like nails on a chalkboard. "That one, that's the house my sister's taking." My wife dropped her drink, I dropped the tongs, and the dog actually backed up 3 steps. Karen, the HOA president, was standing at the edge of our lawn, flanked by a woman in oversized sunglasses, a white designer jumpsuit, and enough perfume to evacuate a beehive. She looked around like she was house shopping at a luxury estate auction. Then she pointed again, not asked, pointed like it was some sort of royal command. "My sister Alexis has decided she wants this house," Karen repeated. "You have 30 days to vacate." Now there are certain moments in life when your brain just doesn't know how to process what's being said. This was one of them. I blinked a few times, looked at my wife, she blinked back. We both laughed, at first not because it was funny, but because it sounded so far beyond stupid it had to be a joke. But Karen's face remained carved in smug stone. Then she stepped forward and handed me a letter printed on some faux official HOA letterhead. The language was wild. It claimed due to an emergency reassignment provision and a special family consideration clause, the property was being transferred to a family member in need. Alexis was listed as the recipient. My name wasn't even mentioned. "You're serious?" I asked, stunned. Karen flipped her bobbed haircut over one shoulder and said, "Absolutely, the board has agreed. You're free to pack now." Alexis chimed in from behind her, "That kitchen's going to need a full gut renovation," she added while scrolling through her phone. She wasn't even making eye contact with us. My wife let out a disbelieving sound and stepped forward to say something, but I held her arm instead. I calmly looked at both of them and nodded slowly. They didn't know it yet, but this entire interaction had just been captured on 6 separate security cameras, including one zoomed tight on the ridiculous paperwork Karen handed me. What they didn't know, and what made this entire stunt spectacularly stupid, was that I was a federal civil court judge, not retired, not part-time, not honorary. I was the active sitting judge currently overseeing a case involving Karen's HOA, a case that included fraudulent assessments, HOA overreach, and illegal occupancy demands. I didn't assign myself the case, obviously, but the judge it went to was a close colleague, and when I'd read the complaint, I almost choked laughing at the name on the defendant line, Karen Matthews. But today I decided to play dumb. I glanced over the letter and tried not to smirk. "Interesting," I said. "Is there a move-in date?" Karen didn't catch the tone and proudly declared, "First week of next month." Alexis already hired movers. In fact, she's bringing by some samples for the new paint this afternoon. You'll want to remove your things before then. Alexis finally looked up from her phone and started taking pictures of our front porch, then walked into our yard without permission, examining the exterior walls. She loudly declared she would be replacing all the windows and probably installing a hot tub out back. It was like we'd turned invisible. She was so entitled she didn't even recognize we were the current legal homeowners. Karen meanwhile began lecturing us about community values and how sacrifices must be made for families undergoing hardship. I asked what kind of hardship Alexis was facing, and Karen said she was emotionally recovering from a divorce. I asked if that was the HOA's concern, and Karen said with a completely straight face, "Emotional health is a community matter. That's in our mission statement." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. My wife stood frozen, trying to process whether we were part of a prank show or if this was real. Karen then dropped one more bombshell. She said she had already changed the HOA's internal database to reflect Alexis as the pending owner of the property, and that the locksmith had been pre-scheduled for the following Friday. I asked if they'd be coming with police. Karen replied confidently, "They won't be needed. You'll be gone by then anyway." I leaned back against the railing and took a deep breath. This wasn't just entitlement, this was a legal ambush by someone who didn't understand how anything worked, and she was arrogant enough to believe she could strong-arm a judge out of his own house on the basis of a fake HOA rule she invented herself. So I leaned forward and said, "You know what, Karen, I appreciate the heads up. Let me just gather a few things before your crew shows up. I'll make it easy for everyone." Karen beamed and said, "See, that's the community spirit we like to see." Alexis said, "Great, can you leave the curtains? They're perfect for my aesthetic." My wife looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I nodded and walked inside. I went straight to my home office, shut the door, and pulled out the folder marked HOA vs. Karen Matthews. I slid in the freshly printed screenshots from the security cams, then typed up a transcript of the entire bizarre interaction. I also called my colleague Judge Mendoza and gave him the update. He started laughing before I finished the sentence. You serious? She showed up to your house to take it. That's the kind of bold that wins awards, he said. Oh, it gets better, I replied. She scheduled a locksmith and declared emotional hardship as a legal transfer clause. He stopped laughing. I'm moving the hearing up, he said. Let's get this on record. Back outside, Alexis was measuring the front porch with her phone and talking about where her Tesla charging station would go. Karen was trying to peek into our garage. I opened the door, smiled, and told them I just called our insurance company to let them know about the upcoming transfer in case anything valuable went missing during the quote transition. Karen looked a little uncertain now, but nodded, trying to keep face. Inside, my wife whispered, "What exactly are you doing?" I whispered back, "I'm letting her dig her own grave, one HOA clause at a time. I'll hand her the shovel when she shows up with the locksmith." That night, Alexis posted a picture of our house on Instagram with the caption "Future Home Vibes" with a heart emoji, and Karen replied, "So happy for you, sis. HOA always has your back." I took a screenshot and added it to the evidence folder. This was going to be one for the ages. She thought I was just another homeowner at the mercy of her fake bylaws. What she didn't know was that I was the one about to rule on her eviction from her own home, and I had every intention of making it poetic justice. The next morning started with Karen marching down the street like a parade marshal on a power trip. She was dressed in a blazer that looked 2 sizes too tight and carried a clipboard as if it were the Holy Grail. She knocked on 3 different doors before she got to mine. I watched her from the upstairs window as she strutted around like she owned the entire subdivision. Right behind her, trailing with the enthusiasm of a hungover intern, was a lanky man in a polo shirt and khakis carrying a tape measure and what looked like a laser scanner. I recognized him instantly. Calvin Raymond, self-proclaimed property assessor, unofficial HOA appraiser, and full-time fraud. I'd seen his name show up in 3 different HOA cases involving illegal rezoning and forged appraisals. He had no real license and was under ongoing investigation. And now here he was, ready to appraise my house for Alexis's benefit. I opened the door before they could knock. Karen greeted me with an overly bright smile and announced that she was conducting a readiness inspection. I pretended to act confused. "I thought you said the transfer wasn't final until next month," I said, eyeing Calvin. Karen laughed and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, this is just routine. Calvin here is certified. Alexis needs to know what renovations to plan for. You understand?" "Of course," I replied, stepping aside. "I'm always eager to help the community." They walked in like real estate agents showing off a model home. Calvin immediately pulled out his scanner and started mumbling numbers to himself. Karen trailed behind him with her clipboard, making notes and muttering things like outdated paint scheme and insufficient lighting in hallway. My wife, seated in the living room with her tablet, looked up with the kind of deadpan expression only someone raised in Brooklyn could master. "Can I help you?" she asked. Karen smiled sweetly. "No need, dear. Just making sure Alexis doesn't have any surprises when she moves in." My wife didn't even blink. "Oh, she's in for a surprise, all right," she said, then went right back to reading. Calvin peeked into our kitchen, nodded approvingly at the granite countertops, and took a few measurements. Karen loudly declared that the island would probably be removed to make space for an open-concept feel. I decided to join them and asked Calvin if he was bonded and licensed. He froze for a second but quickly recovered with a mumbled yes, of course. I asked which state board he was registered with. He gave me a name I knew didn't exist. I smiled, said nothing, and made a mental note to forward that bit to the investigators working on his pending case. Karen moved on to the upstairs and I followed casually, making sure to record everything on the discreet lapel camera I had clipped to my shirt. She walked straight into the master bedroom, looked around, and said Alexis is going to love this space. Probably knock out that wall and extend it into the closet. I chuckled and asked her how she planned to extend it into the neighbor's property. Karen blinked, then smirked. Details, she said. We always find a way. By the time they finished the so-called inspection, Karen was practically giddy. She told me the transfer paperwork would be finalized by Friday, and I should start preparing a list of items we intended to leave behind for the new owner's benefit. Calvin handed me a form, claiming it was a standard occupancy evaluation, and told me to sign at the bottom. I took the form, read it, and immediately recognized 3 falsified lines stating that I had agreed to vacate voluntarily. I looked up and smiled. I'll have my lawyer take a look. Karen stiffened a little but forced a smile. Just routine, nothing to worry about. She left the form on the table and strutted out with Calvin behind her. As soon as the door shut, I picked up the form, walked to my office, scanned it, and sent it to the state licensing board. Then I called Detective Loretta Hahn from the city's HOA fraud unit. She answered on the second ring. I gave her a full summary of the morning and forwarded the video footage, including the moment Calvin lied about his credentials. She groaned. That guy again. We've been waiting for someone to catch him red-handed. You just handed me a gift-wrapped case. The next day, Karen outdid herself. She taped an official-looking notice to our front door claiming the house was under HOA reassignment review and that no changes or modifications could be made without board approval. The paper had a giant red stamp across it that said property transfer pending in block letters. Neighbors walking their dogs paused, stared, and began whispering. Within hours, I'd received 2 texts from longtime residents asking if we were really moving out. One even offered to help us pack. I responded with a smiley face and said all was well, just an HOA mix-up. Karen must have thought she was winning. She even walked past later that afternoon and waved at my wife with the kind of smugness that made you want to water your lawn at her feet. What Karen didn't realize was that the court case involving her financial mishandling had just been escalated to federal review after a tip from one of her own board members. I wasn't part of the trial directly, but I had quietly flagged the file for fast-track review. The evidence pile was growing rapidly. Unauthorized assessments, phantom charges, suspicious reimbursements, and now fraudulent property transfers. The prosecutor on the case was a sharp bulldog named Carla Morse, and she didn't like bullies. That evening, I met with 3 HOA board members at a coffee shop downtown. None of them were fans of Karen, and one of them, Margot, was nearly in tears. She said Karen forged her signature on several documents and threatened to fine her for leaking board decisions. The other 2, Reggie and Louis, nodded solemnly. They all confirmed that no such property reassignment clause existed in the bylaws. Karen had made it up on her own. I asked if they were willing to testify. Margot hesitated, but Reggie said flatly, she's ruined lives. Yeah, I'll speak up. We're done living scared of her. I told them everything would be handled legally, and no one would be left hanging. They all agreed to meet again at my house for a formal HOA emergency meeting. Karen wasn't going to like that. By the time I got home, Karen's sister had posted another photo of our house on social media. This one had the caption "Moving Day Countdown Begins" with a heart and sparkle emoji. It was followed by a comment from Karen that read, "Can't wait to see you in your new home, next step paint samples." I took one last look at the photo, then filed it away with the rest of the evidence. If they wanted to play dirty, I could play legal. The difference was I actually knew how the system worked. Karen was about to discover that you can only fake power for so long before the real thing shows up with a badge and a court order. The next week passed with eerie silence from Karen, which only made me more suspicious. It was like the eye of a storm had settled over our street, calm but hiding a whirlwind behind it. I knew she wasn't finished, not even close. Sure enough, on Friday afternoon, I received a group message from one of the HOA board members, Reggie. Apparently, Karen had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting for Sunday. The topic was vague, but Reggie suspected she was trying to legitimize the fake reassignment of my property by getting a rubber stamp vote from the remaining board members who were still scared of her. I responded by offering my home as the new meeting location. If Karen was trying to stage another stunt, I wanted her to do it where I could control the setting, the witnesses, and most importantly, the cameras. Sunday arrived, and with it, an unexpected tension in the air. I made fresh coffee, set out chairs in the living room, and ensured all 6 cameras were rolling. My wife prepared snacks like we were hosting a casual game night. By noon, Reggie, Louis, and Margot were seated with us, looking around nervously. They'd brought copies of the HOA bylaws, prior meeting notes, and a few documents they had quietly rescued from Karen's locked file cabinet. Each one of them had a story about how Karen had manipulated board votes, changed fines without approval, and invented rules to control residents. The expressions on their faces weren't just fear, they were embarrassment and frustration. They had been tricked for so long, and now that the fog was lifting, they were furious. At exactly 1 o'clock, the front door swung open without a knock. Karen marched in like she still owned the place, her heels clicking on the hardwood like a metronome of madness. Right behind her was Alexis, wearing oversized sunglasses indoors and carrying a binder that looked more like a fashion magazine than any legal document. Karen didn't even look at anyone as she walked toward the center of the room and said, "Let's get this started." Everyone looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I simply smiled and said, "Welcome, Karen. Meeting's already in session. Have a seat." Karen scanned the room, immediately noticing that I had taken the head seat. Her eyes darted to the board members, who were now visibly backing me. She narrowed her gaze. "This isn't a sanctioned meeting. You can't hold a meeting without the president's approval." Margot, voice trembling but clear, replied, "Actually, the bylaws say any 3 board members can call a meeting. And we did." Karen turned slowly toward her, eyes wide with disbelief, as if Margot had just betrayed her in public. Alexis flopped onto the couch with a sigh and said, "So can we go over move-in timelines? I've already picked out furniture." Karen raised a hand to silence her, then turned back to the board. "This is nonsense. This is my HOA. I built it. This man doesn't even belong here." She pointed directly at me, shaking with rage. I leaned back in my chair, calm as ever. "Well, Karen, funny you mention that. Because the agenda today includes some clarity about legal property boundaries and ownership. Would you like to start by explaining the reassignment clause?" She opened her mouth to speak but froze when I pulled out a printed copy of the fake transfer letter she'd handed me, complete with forged signatures and a fabricated HOA stamp. I slid it across the table. "Please, explain how this was approved." Karen's face twitched. "That's internal documentation. You have no right to." Reggie cut her off. "We've never seen that letter. Where did you get that stamp?" Karen's jaw clenched. "It's official HOA property. I have authority." Louis spoke next. "That stamp was decommissioned 2 years ago. You're not supposed to use it anymore." I didn't need to say a word. The board was speaking for me now. I just watched as the walls Karen had built so confidently began to crumble in front of her. Her face went pale. Then she did what all cornered bullies do. She lashed out. She screamed at the board for being cowards, accused them of betrayal, and claimed I was conspiring against her. Then she turned to Alexis and hissed, "We're leaving. These people are insane." Alexis looked up from her phone and asked, "So I'm not getting the house?" Karen didn't answer. She just stormed out the front door with Alexis trailing behind her in a haze of confusion and designer perfume. After they left, I turned to the board members. "That," I said, "is how you dismantle an empire built on intimidation." We spent the next hour organizing documents, drafting an emergency resolution to suspend Karen's presidential powers, and agreeing to file for a full community audit. I offered to connect them with the appropriate legal resources and even draft a preliminary motion to the county's HOA Oversight Board. They were tired but relieved. For the first time in months, they weren't being bullied. Later that evening, as the sun set and the last of the board members left, my wife and I sat on the back porch drinking tea. She looked at me and asked, "So now what?" I smiled. "Now we wait. She'll either escalate or retreat. But either way, she's exposed. And I have everything on record." Just as I finished speaking, my phone buzzed. It was an alert from our security system. Someone was on the front porch. I checked the feed and there she was again, Karen. But this time, she wasn't yelling or waving fake document. She was sobbing. Her face was streaked with tears, her clothes were disheveled, and she looked 10 years older than she had that morning. She sat on the steps, holding her head in her hands. I didn't go outside. I watched silently as she sat there for 10 minutes before finally walking away into the dark. No car, no Alexis, just her. Something had cracked. I had no doubt she'd be back, but not the same way. The show wasn't over. Not yet. Karen had just realized she'd lost control. And people like her don't handle that quietly. Inside, I reviewed the footage from the meeting and began organizing the files for the upcoming hearings. The story wasn't finished. Karen still had cards to play. But I had the truth, the law, and a court date with her name on it. And this time, she wouldn't be the one pointing fingers. She'd be the one answering questions, with a judge's gavel calling the shots. By Tuesday morning, the entire neighborhood had turned into a living rumor mill. It started with a few subtle glances during dog walks, then turned into whispers at mailboxes, and by mid-afternoon, it was full-blown speculation. People were openly discussing whether Karen had been fired, sued, or run out of town. Someone even claimed she had been arrested, which, while not yet true, wasn't too far from the future. I stayed quiet. I went about my day like nothing unusual had happened, sipping coffee on the porch while neighbors passed by a little too slowly, clearly hoping I'd confirm or deny something. I gave them a polite nod and let their imaginations do the rest. That same day, Margot called to tell me that several HOA members had begun withdrawing automatic payments. Others were demanding to see the books, something Karen had refused to share for years. A petition had begun circulating to formally remove her as president and freeze all HOA spending until a full audit could be performed. She said, almost in disbelief, that people were finally realizing they had been paying into something that didn't make sense. I told her to keep everything documented and suggested she prepare for a transition. Karen's reign was unraveling, and now it wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about everything she had tried to control through fear and manipulation. That evening, I received a package on my porch with no return label. Inside was a manila envelope packed with old financial documents, board meeting notes, and a flash drive. The handwriting on the note simply said, "Thought you should have these." Whoever sent it wanted to stay anonymous, but the files spoke volumes. The drive contained spreadsheets showing Karen had created duplicate invoices and paid herself back for non-existent expenses. One document even showed she used HOA funds to pay a landscaping crew to service her sister's house across town. Another line item covered an Airbnb rental during a supposed conference trip that had no confirmation. The amount of misappropriation was staggering. I forwarded the documents to Carla Morse, the prosecutor assigned to the HOA case. Within the hour, she replied with one sentence, "This is enough for felony charges." The next day, a team from the state auditor's office arrived at the HOA office. They were armed with clipboards, laptops, and a level of determination that only shows up when someone knows they've found a live wire. Karen wasn't there. In fact, she hadn't been seen all morning. Alexis, however, had posted a cryptic Instagram story about being targeted by jealous haters, and that greatness always scares the small-minded. She also mentioned her upcoming move-in with a smiling selfie in front of our mailbox. I stood by the window, watching the auditors march in and out of the small HOA office like a SWAT team with laptop. Then around noon, Karen's SUV screeched into the parking lot. She leapt out of the car, wild-eyed and shouting before she even reached the door. Neighbors gathered. Phones came out. And just like that, Karen's meltdown went viral. She screamed about private property, fake audits, and personal vendettas. She tried to grab documents from one of the state agents, who calmly handed her a printed warrant authorizing the investigation. She snatched it, tore it in half, then stomped off in tears. The agents barely blinked. One of them calmly picked up the torn paper, pulled out a second copy from his folder, and continued working. That single scene told everyone watching exactly who was in control now. Back at home, I received a message from Officer Riggs, the same officer who had previously been assigned to our neighborhood complaints. He said Karen had tried to file a harassment claim against me and the HOA board. When he asked for evidence, she produced her infamous fake transfer letter and a list of grievances that included statements like, "He's occupying my sister's future home." Riggs told her calmly that not only was the letter forged, but the property was in no legal dispute and the transfer clause she kept referencing did not exist anywhere in municipal code. She apparently left the station in tears, muttering about betrayal and conspiracies. That night, Alexis did what Karen hadn't dared. She made a move. Around 10, our motion sensor lights flickered on. I checked the front camera and saw her standing at the edge of the lawn with a man holding a tool bag. She was pointing at the front door, arguing with him. I opened the door before she could step closer. She flinched, clearly not expecting me. I kept my tone polite. "Can I help you with something?" She forced a smile. "I thought we'd just get a head start on replacing the lock. You'll want to get your stuff out soon anyway." I stepped out onto the porch, phone already recording in my hand. "Alexis, there's no legal transfer, no court order, and no authority giving you any right to this home. Any attempt to enter this property without my permission is criminal trespass." She started to protest, but the man with the tool bag was already backing away toward his van. She called after him, but he was gone. Then she turned to me with fire in her eyes. "This isn't over." I smiled calmly. "You're right. It isn't. But next time you try something like this, you might want to consult a real lawyer instead of your sister." She turned, stormed off, and drove away into the night. 2 days later, the city posted an official notice on Karen's property. Due to unpaid HOA-related taxes and outstanding violations, her house was slated for a lien. An audit summary had been delivered to the local courthouse, and Karen had 48 hours to respond or risk full foreclosure and seizure. It was poetic. She had tried to take my home with fake documents and inflated confidence, and now hers was being stripped away legally, brick by brick. The neighborhood had changed too. People who used to avoid eye contact now waved and smiled. Reggie told me he'd been asked by several residents to run for HOA president. Margot said her daughter slept better now that Karen didn't drive around late at night inspecting trash bins like a lunatic. Even the neighborhood watch chat was more relaxed. One member simply posted 3 words that made everyone laugh. "The witch melted." That evening, as I watered the plants, my wife came out with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. She sat beside me on the porch and raised hers for a toast. "To the storm that passed." I clinked my glass gently against hers. "And to the one still coming." Because I knew one thing for sure, Karen wasn't going down without a last desperate move. She wasn't the type to accept consequences. Not quietly. Not ever. The final blow came on a rainy Wednesday morning, the kind of overcast sky that made everything feel heavier. I had just poured myself a cup of coffee when I received a call from Carla Morse. Her voice was sharp, direct, and vibrating with purpose. "It's happening," she said. I asked if she meant what I thought, and she confirmed it. Warrants were being served. Charges were being filed. Karen Matthews was finally going to face real consequences for years of fraudulent activity, abuse of authority, and misappropriation of HOA funds. I sat back in my chair and stared out at the wet street, watching the rain streak down the windows like the last curtain closing on her fake empire. 2 black sedans and a city code enforcement vehicle pulled up in front of her house an hour later. Officers in plain clothes approached her front door with purpose. She opened it slowly, confused, her eyes darting nervously. I watched from my porch as they spoke calmly, then handed her a folder thick with documents. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Her face said everything. Her lips moved like she was trying to bargain, explain, deflect. Then her legs gave out slightly, and she had to grab the doorframe to stay upright. They didn't cuff her right there, but she was served with an official notice of court summons, civil charges, and a pending criminal case tied to misuse of HOA funds and attempted property seizure under fraudulent pretenses. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Later that afternoon, Reggie came over to hand me a copy of the finalized petition to remove Karen as HOA president. It had been signed by over 80% of the homeowners in the community. In the space of just 2 weeks, Karen had gone from untouchable tyrant to universally condemned. Reggie said the new board would be meeting the following Sunday to elect a new president and approve transparency reforms. I suggested they begin with a financial audit every quarter and an open forum for community vote. He nodded, then laughed and said, "You really did this by just sitting on your porch and sipping coffee?" I smiled back and said, "That's the thing about power. Real power doesn't shout. It just waits for the noise to fall apart." But Karen wasn't quite finished. The next evening, she posted a long unhinged rant on the community forum claiming she was the victim of a targeted conspiracy, calling me a plant from a rival development company, and accusing the HOA board of being bribed by shadow investors. She claimed Alexis had been denied her dream home due to jealousy, and that the reassignment clause was real but misunderstood. Most replies were sarcastic gifs or laughing emojis. One person asked if she needed professional help. Another posted a photo of her house with the caption "Eviction vibes pending." The biggest surprise came at the end of the week when a moving truck showed up in front of Karen's home. It wasn't the kind that arrived quietly. It was a massive, diesel-chugging behemoth with 2 men in jumpsuits and clipboards. They didn't knock. They walked straight into the house with a copy of the foreclosure order and a list of items to be removed. Karen came out screaming, demanding to know who authorized this. One of the movers calmly pointed to the court stamp on the document. She tried to block the doorway but was physically escorted aside by a sheriff's deputy who had been assigned to enforce the order. The entire street gathered to watch. A few neighbors brought lawn chairs. One guy handed out popcorn. Karen's prized art pieces, her furniture, and her massive collection of HOA awards were packed up and rolled out like items at a garage sale. She stood there motionless, lips trembling, arms crossed tightly against her chest, as the house she ruled like a kingdom was dismantled right in front of her. Alexis pulled up halfway through, still in her Instagram influencer getup, and asked what was happening. Karen snapped something about betrayal, false charges, and unfair legal systems. Alexis took one look at the chaos and muttered, "I'm not going down with you," then drove off without another word. 2 days later, her house was listed publicly for auction. Proceeds would go toward covering the legal penalties and reimbursing the HOA for lost funds. I heard from Carla that more charges were likely to follow once forensic accountants finished digging through her years of falsified record. Her bank accounts had already been frozen, and the civil court was preparing to assign restitution payments for residents who had been overcharged or fined unlawfully. One board member even discovered she'd been double-billed for landscaping for 3 years. As for Alexis, her social media accounts went dark. Word got around that she'd tried to rent an apartment nearby under a fake name, but someone recognized her and reported it to the leasing office. Rumor was she moved back in with a distant cousin across the state, blaming the whole thing on mental stress and sabotage. She never apologized, never admitted anything, just disappeared the way people do when the internet turns against them. On the day of the new HOA election, I attended quietly as a resident. Margot was elected president with unanimous approval. Reggie and Louis became treasurer and secretary, respectively. They passed 5 new rules focused on transparency, financial oversight, and term limit. At the end of the meeting, Margot stood up and said, "Let's rebuild trust." That's all anyone wanted to hear. The applause that followed felt real, not forced like during Karen's reign. Back at home, my wife and I sat on the porch again, this time watching kids play in the street, neighbors chatting like old friends, and a peaceful quiet settling over the place. She leaned into me and said, "You think she'll ever show her face again?" I shook my head. "Not here. She burned every bridge on her way down. People like her always think they're untouchable. Then the truth taps them on the shoulder." She nodded and smiled as she raised her glass. I'd made a small wooden sign earlier that day and hung it under the fake one Karen had posted weeks ago, the one that had claimed the house for Alexis. Hers was still there, faded and cracked, but underneath it, my sign read "Evicted by Karma. Authorized by the court. No HOA approval required." As the sun dipped below the rooftops and the street lights flickered on, I realized something simple but profound. Justice doesn't always come with sirens or news cameras. Sometimes it shows up quietly, disguised as patience, law, and a mountain of receipts. Karen came for my house, but what she really did was hand me the blueprint for her own downfall. All I had to do was let her build it.